John and everyone here at the University of Florida who's been involved in putting together this magnificent program and inviting me to participate in it. I realized that my title here, The End of Books, is a little bit intimidating compared to talking about titles earlier. And so I want to begin by saying that I'm not actually predicting the end of books. What I mean to do with this title is simply to consider not the end of books per se, but the possibility that the status of printed books might change in our culture and, frankly, diminish. So it might be more in the spirit of this conference to suggest the title of The Future of Books. And I do not pretend to be able to give a comprehensive account of the future of the book either, but I don't have to because of the work of so many of the other speakers and respondents at the symposium. Lisa and David and their respondents yesterday have given us much to think about, and I know we're all looking forward to hearing what Bob has to say in the afternoon into Terry's response. So I only propose to offer some observations from my perspective, which is an admittedly idiosyncratic one, or at least different, for reasons that I was suggesting in the panel last hour, because I now work in a program of digital media where the book itself, the printed book, is no longer the central media artifact. We could ask the question about the future of the book or the future of books in several ways. The future of the book as a form, the future of the book in its materiality, that is, in print, the future of literature or literacy in print, the future of certain forms of discursive knowledge that have become and been so powerful and influential in the age of print. But I want to start in a somewhat different place. As I say, I work in a digital media program, and my context is therefore other media, largely digital media. And so I want to begin not with books themselves, but with media culture in which books are situated. It is hard to write about the size and scope of our current media culture without superlatives. Traditional television and film still have audiences in the hundreds of millions, sometimes billions, if you think about the Olympics. And the newer participatory digital media have now reached comparable levels. A survey of the internet in 2010, therefore already obsolete, put the number of internet users at 1.97 billion, almost 2 billion, a percentage of the Earth's population that is incomprehensibly large. The number of websites predicted or estimated at 255 million. The number of Facebook users at 600 million, and you can see some of the other figures for social media. The number of blogs at 152 million. 2010 saw 25 billion tweets on the microblogging site Twitter. And these figures, as I've said, are already out of date. I've heard the figure 800 million for Facebook, or Mashable.com just reported 1 billion users. As the Sean Parker character says in The Social Network, $1 million isn't cool. You know what's cool? $1 billion. Well, by that metric, Facebook is or soon will be cool. I cite this, and then I immediately become conscious of engaging in a rhetoric of infinite growth. This is the rhetoric, perhaps associated with the notion of the rhetoric of crisis that Terry was talking about a few minutes ago, that's claimed over and over again for various digital media forms. For example, for MMOs like Second Life, you heard that claim in the mid-2000s, of the last decade. The notion that these forms are undergoing exponential growth, and the prediction, therefore, that the rate will eventually include everyone on Earth. And of course, the growth often is exponential at first until it approaches some asymptote, which is, almost always, much less than everyone on Earth. The exception seems to be Facebook, whose asymptote, if it's reaching it now, is 1/7 of the Earth's population, or 1/2 of everybody online. 35 hours of video were uploaded to YouTube every minute in 2010. 2 billion YouTube videos were viewed in that year. 3 billion photos were uploaded to Facebook every month. Both in absolute numbers and in rates of participation, more people in the developed countries of North America, Europe, and Asia are publishing or communicating in digital form than could ever have been possible in the case of print. Now, you've heard figures like these, and perhaps you've become inured to them. Perhaps you find it irrelevant to think in these terms. But I suggest that it is sometimes useful to do so, if only as an exercise in a kind of intellectual humility. The condition of media culture today is what I would call a plenitude, an abundance that easily accommodates and indeed swallows up the contradictory forces of old and new media, high and popular culture, and any ability on our part to appreciate its size and diversity. This is an image that attempts to make sense of that plenitude. It's a map that purports to show millions of Facebook friendships as links between the cities in which the individuals are located. The Facebook links themselves define the shapes of continents and countries and suggest how strong a force new media may be, how massive the connections are. Yet it also familiarizes these enormous numbers for us by giving them shapes that we already know. This is an image that I actually prefer for the digital plenitude. Hundreds of millions of active IP addresses on the internet, with special coloring to indicate size and speed, made by Barrett Lyon and his so-called OPT project, which seems to have ended in 2005, so it too is already out of date, although in this case, I think it makes little difference. This visualization, which has been displayed at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, quite obviously makes the internet look like a portion of the sky photographed by a telescope and then enhanced with false colors. What it reveals most of all is the enormity of the internet, its beauty coming from, and in a sense, masking the complexity of the whole. And when we remember that this image represents internet connections, I can't help thinking of William Gibson's definition of cyberspace. Lisa invoked Gibson yesterday in her analysis of reading. A consensual hallucination experienced daily by billions of legitimate operators in every nation, by children being taught mathematical concepts, a graphical representation of data abstracted from the banks of every computer in the human system, unthinkable complexity, lines of light ranged in the non-space of the mind, clusters and constellations of data. Let's focus on one location in that plenitude, a domain name and IP address in the digital plenitude corresponding to a historically important center in the world of media, loc.gov, the Library of Congress. Here's the physical correlate of that homepage, the reading room of the Library of Congress, a portal to its vast holdings. Now, the Library of Congress could stand for a key site in what McLuhan called the Gutenberg Galaxy, though you may already be tired of my astronomical metaphors, and I promise this is the last one. This, as I said, is the main reading room, which on the LOC website, the text describing it tells us that it is a principal point for gaining access to the library's general collections of books and bound periodicals. Every researcher who will go on to work in one of the specialized reading rooms often begins their work in the main reading room in order to use the electronic resources in the Computer Catalog Center to consult the main card catalog, to obtain an orientation to the library as a whole, or to use some of the approximately 70,000 volumes in the main reading room reference collection. And further, on the site, they describe the holdings of the Library of Congress as a whole. The Library of Congress is the largest library in the world, with more than 147 million items, approximately 838 miles of bookshelves. The collections include more than 33 million books and other print materials, 3 million recordings, 12.5 million photographs, 4.5 million maps, 6 million pieces of sheet music, and 64.5 million manuscripts. Vast. and yet its volume is already dwarfed by the volume of data on the internet. If we compare this statement to the Pingdom figures that we were looking at earlier, for example, every 9 days, the recordings on YouTube are equal to all the recordings in the Library of Congress. Now, even before the advent of computerization, say in 1950, someone sitting in the reading room of the British Museum or the Library of Congress confronted millions of printed books. No one could claim to have assimilated more than a tiny fraction of this world of print, and the residual manuscripts from the Middle Ages. And even then, to call it an age of print would be misleading because there were already an important mix of other media, radio, film, television, and so on, the kind of hybridity that Terry was referring to. Yet the size and diversity of the media culture at that time did not seem to call into question the status of the book or its particular ways of constituting knowledge, perhaps because the dominant influence of print in our systems of education gave us the impression that through print technology, knowledge was under control. Just looking at the reading room architecture suggests a physical organization that was also an epistemological one. Knowledge both in its place and accessible. Libraries in the age of print were, and largely remain, hierarchically organized in a way to suggest that a reader could master a subject. Rows of drawers housed cards in alphabetical order to provide access to the books, and the books themselves were arranged by subject and author in miles of shelves in the stacks. The tangible presence of the catalogs gave the impression of order and comprehensibility for the collections of books and the knowledge they contained. Most of the books, of course, were and are themselves constructed as a hierarchy of chapters, and the contents of each book remained the same from the day of printing until its deterioration. Even though the sheer amount of the material, images as well as texts, and increasingly in the 20th century, film and video, would overwhelm any single reader or viewer, the institutions like the Library of Congress and the practice of print worked to inspire a sense that the universe of knowledge contained in books was in order. On the collective scale, the library, and on the individual scale, encyclopedias, handbooks, bibliographies, and textbooks all contributed to the sense that knowledge was under control. I know I sound like Marshall McLuhan here, making a deterministic claim about print encouraging linearity of thinking and visual organization of knowledge, and then perhaps suggesting the electronic medium causing this organization to implode. But I am making a claim not so much about the impact of technology on our senses or on our mental capacities, but rather on our assumptions about the nature of knowledge. It is the assumptions that are now challenged, our cultural preferences for certain kinds of knowledge structures. Now, in any case, the Library of Congress is still standing, still embodying an organization of knowledge, and in fact using digital technology to facilitate that organization through its electronic catalog. What has changed then? It is that the Library of Congress is no longer the agreed upon center of a galaxy of organized knowledge. It is a center, one of many in the plenitude of our media culture. And as we know, the plenitude is in the process of absorbing printed books into its digital space. First, simply by digitizing them. The Google database of books, as reported here, stands at 5.2 million in 2010, about 500 billion words. Quote, it consists of the 500 billion words contained in books published between 1500 and 2008 in English, French, Spanish, German, Chinese, and Russian. It seems unlikely in the long run that the publishing industry can hold back this kind of sweeping transfer into digital form. Whatever else happens, a large fraction of materials now in print will become available online. But, as we were saying in the panel today, not necessarily everything. It's very interesting, perhaps traumatic, perhaps a crisis, to consider in any given transfer like the one that we're undergoing, what gets left behind. So this is not the first time we've had a transfer from one reading knowledge technology to another. One can think, for example, of the transfer from the papyrus roll to the codex in the late antiquity, the transfer obviously from manuscripts or codices to printed books in the 15th, 16th century. And in each of those cases, there were lots of texts that didn't make it into the new technology, into the new medium, and therefore were left behind. We have the technology today, if we were willing to expend the energy and the costs, and also there would be political and social issues, of transferring virtually everything in some way, however inadequately, perhaps not doing justice, as Terry said, to the paratextual characteristics. But there's a question of whether we would even do that. How much of manuscripts will be left behind? How many different kinds of print materials will not be transferred? These are issues that we know historically are important. There are historical precedents for that issue. So where is this process of digitization taking us? Well, in 1999, the usability expert Jakob Nielsen predicted the end of books by 2007. He said, we have to wait until approximately 2007 for books to go away and be fully replaced with online information. Legacy publishers, be warned, this will happen. Well, it didn't happen. And ironically, he made the prediction in print and in a book that we can still buy. The prediction itself represents the kind of engineering thinking or operational thinking that does not take into account the uneven evolution of cultural forms. After all, our culture could have started the process of getting rid of the book as early as the advent of the personal computer, perhaps even earlier with the larger databases supported by mainframes. But we didn't. Nielsen's assumption is that as soon as a technology exists that makes such a transfer possible, it will naturally happen. But as we know, culture doesn't work that way. His further assumption, by the way, which is informed by his understanding of digital technology at the turn of the millennium, was that hypertextual reading and writing would progress to the point so as to render the book obsolete. He thought of his model was really the web browser, that we would be transferring everything to and consuming it under a kind of web browser interface and using links much more extensively as a result. That obviously is not what happened. Here's what's happening, as we all know. The Kindle and the iPad. Amazon released the Kindle first generation in November of 2007, so at least you got that, you're right. That and the iPad in 2009 have had extraordinary impact. In May of 2011, Amazon announced that it is selling more Kindle books than paperback books. So this new form is clearly emerging now, finally, as an alternative acceptable, if not preferable, to millions of readers. And as we all know, in July 2011, Borders, the second largest book chain, announced liquidation. Now, all kinds of books are involved in this transfer. There's a large world of trade books of all kinds, popular fiction, all being sold in ebook form in addition to printed form. The overwhelming majority of ebooks are simply copies, adequate or less than ideal, sometimes without illustrations, of their printed equivalents. But the publishing community may be grudgingly accepting this change in technology precisely because they don't think that it requires a reconception of the form or the cultural position of the book. This example of an enhanced book may be what they expect to happen. David referred yesterday to the article in the Wall Street Journal called Exploding the Book, and this is one of the examples that the journal article cites of an enhanced book. How radical really is the ebook, or even this enhanced book, as a reconceptualization of the experience of reading? I would point here to the case, analogous case of Hollywood film. First there was, of course, the video cassette as a new format for distributing film, which was linear, really just presented the experience of the movie on the small screen of your home rather than on the large screen. Then there was the DVD, and now the various forms of streaming platforms, from phones, that is to say, from very small screen formats to computers. In all these cases, however, they're still presenting what is more or less understood as the canonical version of the film. In other words, the change of technologies has not resulted yet, and may never result in a change in conceptualization of the form. This didn't have to be the case, however, that is, this conservatism didn't have to be the case even with film. If you think about the DVD, it did and does have the opportunity to present a somewhat more synoptic and varied presentation of the filmic materials. So you can not only go and zoom into a particular scene that you want to watch, but you can also, in some cases, get the alternate scenes, alternate endings, documentaries on the making of the film, alternate soundtracks, the director's voiceover describing the making of the film. One could have imagined that this would develop into a more hyper-textual or hyper-mediated version of filmic experience where you could really move through the film in creative ways. And there were experiments in this direction with being able to control the point of view, for example. But even that relatively modest kind of experimentation seems to be, if anything, fading now with the growth of internet film consumption, because the internet, again, at least at present, the streaming methods of viewing these films tends to reinforce the linearity and make the experience more like viewing traditionally was than the DVD. The case of ebooks is very similar. Ebooks could facilitate certain kinds of intervention into the text, and do, making notes that you can collect, Amazon's feature of sharing highlights among various readers of the same book, suggesting social media features that may well grow. But all this is happening without really challenging the canonical form of the book. When you download a book to your Kindle or iPad, you still think of it as having a canonical shape and order that you may intervene in various ways. So, as I say, the response of the publishing industry to the changing forms and preferences of its readership in the age of digital technology has been at best uneven, perhaps confused, but in general, they've seen this new form as a question of economic change rather than conceptual change. Now, I want to digress for a moment to a particular historical thread in this development of the impact of the digital on the literary world. And perhaps this isn't really a digression, because I think it illustrates the state and perhaps the future of print in the digital media plenitude. I mean to take the case of literature, and the first serious attempt to challenge the form of the printed book in the hypertext fiction movement. This started back around 1990 with authors such as Michael Joyce and Stuart Moulthrop and many others working in forms of hypertext fiction in relatively simple reading platforms on personal computers. There were some embedded static graphics, but mostly these early hypertexts were textual, verbal, with a point-and-click interface. They were simple technologically, but they were by no means simple aesthetically. They were sincere attempts to explore the possibilities of a new mode of positioning the reader in relationship to the text. I'm thinking of things like Afternoon or Victory Garden. These were also narrative and literary works in conscious relation to the literary tradition. They were attempts at, quote, serious fiction. They were avant-garde in the sense that they challenged conventional print literature, which had been and has been the dominant form of literary expression for hundreds of years. And they were positioned as avant-garde both by their critics and by their supporters. That is, as a challenge at the medium-specific level to the nature of literature. The most famous expression of that challenge came from Robert Coover in his New York Times piece, The End of Books, when he attempted to introduce hypertext to what we'll call the mainstream literary world. With its web of linked lexia, its networks of alternate routes as opposed to print's fixed unidirectional page turning, hypertext presents a radically divergent technology, interactive and polyvocal, favoring a plurality of discourses over definitive utterances, and freeing the reader from domination by the author. So Coover immediately assumed an oppositional stance between this new literary practice and the literary mainstream embodied in print. And what was the reaction from the literary community? Well, the reaction to the hypertext literary movement, or this beginning, the spring of hypertext, was largely indifference. They ignored it. But when they did notice it all, they generally regarded hypertext as the end of Western civilization. So this was embodied several years later in a piece that Laura Miller wrote for the literary establishment, which appeared online. I don't think it actually ever even appeared in the New York Times book review itself, called claptrap.com, in which she responds to Coover and says, Coover sees readers who fall asleep on 4 or 5 books a year and, quote, surrender to novels as a way of going on holiday from themselves as weaklings, insufficiently girded for the glorious battle ahead. That surrender, though, and the intimacy to be had in allowing a beloved author's voices into the sanctum of our minds are what the common reader craves. So she praises traditional literary reception in almost sexual terms, the surrender of the reader to the author. Hypertext becomes, in her view, almost literally a perversion. And that was, as I said, largely the reaction in the 1990s. Michael Joyce and the other early hypertext writers produced a new kind of narrative, and these experiments are and were very interesting, but ultimately not successful in the sense of becoming mainstream. Mainstream high literature continued on its own trajectory in print. Meanwhile, electronic or digital literature continued on its trajectory too. Hypermedia had some continued development in the 1990s, but later in the 90s and into the 2000s, there were other forms of electronic literature that emphasized the dynamic relationship of the text to the reader in different ways. Forms like John Cayley's work in e-poetry, or this, more recently actually, this piece by Stephen Tomasula, Talk, which was published in 2010. So it's not by any means to say that digital literature or electronic literature is dead. It is, however, speaking to a small community, or if it's growing away from being part of the literary tradition and mainstream and into something that one could call digital art. It's particularly true of Talk. Even though it calls itself a multimedia novel, it looks and feels almost like a piece of digital installation art. Now, my view is clearly more pessimistic in this regard, in regard to the importance of these kinds of digital literary media forms, like Lexia or Perplexia, than Lisa's was yesterday. I think that the digital plenitude can include this kind of literary production, but among literally thousands or tens of thousands of other kinds of reading and writing practices, with no more claim to centrality in the current digital culture than those other practices. So where are we? Where is the literary mainstream today? I mean the community of publishers, critics, and authors who deal with what is still thought of as serious fiction and nonfiction as presented in vehicles like the New York Review of Books. For that community, print remains the fixed, print remains the medium of literary and discursive expression. Texts are written by authors in a fixed order and consumed by readers. The literary mainstream has not accepted the digital as a platform for a new kind of literature or a new kind of nonfiction. And indeed, it is not really ready to acknowledge a new place for the book in our media culture, as this particular issue of the New York Review of Books describes by Robert Darnton, the litigation over the Google Books attempt to take over the process of digitizing the past, the literary and print heritage of the past, It's clear that for the publishing industry, for many segments of the book world, intellectual property is a more compelling issue than the form of the future of reading and writing practices. So that's the case for the publishing industry. I want to make a few remarks about the institutions of education and their relationship to this new incursions, the new digital media. So it's obvious, but it's worth mentioning, that the institutions of learning, of education, not only in the United States, but all throughout Western culture, have for hundreds of years been built around texts and printed books. It's interesting to note that each of the earlier technologies of mechanical reproduction have, in the 20th century, 19th and 20th century, have been predicted to displace or take a place in the educational world alongside the printed book, and in each case they really haven't succeeded in doing so. I've collected a few quotations here from the ages. First, this one is from the 19th century, is a prediction that stereoscopic photographs would in fact become central to our experience of the world, and people will be going to the libraries to see vast collections of stereoscopic materials the way they go now to find printed books. More recently, and by more recently I mean in the 20th century, we can see predictions for film, photography, radio, television in the same light. Here's Edison saying, "I believe that the motion picture is destined to revolutionize our educational system, and that in a few years it will supplant largely, if not entirely, the use of textbooks." Franz Roh, a Munich art critic, in a book called Mechanism and Expression in 1929, predicted that we would soon reach a point where it would be considered illiterate to be unable to handle a camera. So prediction that kind of photographic practice would enter into our educated culture in a central way. This is a prediction about radio having that same capacity to be important. And then in summary, I've actually gotten these quotations from the book by Larry Kuban on the relationship of technology and education, pointing out the obvious, which is that none of these technological practices has had that kind of an impact, and suggesting, in fact, in the 1980s when he wrote this, that the computer won't either. Well, it's worth saying two things. One is that each one of those earlier practices did have some impact, or did enter to some extent into educational practices in various ways. There were educational films that were shown in schools. There are ways in which photography was entered into our education. Obviously, our textbooks are full of photographs now. So it's always a more complicated and hybrid explanation than simply a linear one that indicates the text, the printed text excludes everything else. Nonetheless, I think it's fair to say that the text, the notion of education being very, very much associated with printed texts and with verbal expression is something that has dominated 20th century educational practice. But it's interesting to think about the computer in this context, because there is a sense in which the computer is maybe the first one of these new technologies that actually challenges the status of the book and of print in terms of our educational practices. It seems to be winning a broader acceptance as having a place in universities, high schools, even primary schools, than any of these earlier forms. So, and we've already talked about Apple's textbook initiative that came out, that was announced this week. Whether this is successful or not is something that we'll find out. We'll judge in the future. But my point would just be that it's being taken seriously, either for good or for ill, in a way that indicates a readiness, a willingness to have that discussion about the form of the book and the relationship of the digital to education in ways that wouldn't have happened, it didn't happen with any of these previous technologies. In fact, the most obvious comparison would be the way television was treated and received by the educational establishment, really from the middle of the 20th century on, which is with great suspicion and hostility. Television was regarded as the force that was dangerous, that was anti-educational, that took us away from reading. And there was a whole rhetoric of, if you will, Terry crisis that was focused on television as the popular media form that challenged, that dumbed us down as a society. That, you still hear that a little bit, but it seems that if anything, video games have taken that role, right, as the evil force that's dumbing our culture now, as opposed to television. I would just say, with regard to the university and the relationship to the digital, one also hears, and has heard for years now, the predictions that the university will be completely remade and undone and reconfigured, if not made obsolete by various forms of digital technology. And I'm sure many of us in this room, especially the older ones of us, have been on panels entitled "The Future of the University," in which someone would get up and say, well, like Jacob Nielsen in that quote, get yourself into another line of work soon, because in 6 years everyone's going to be learning online, everyone's going to be downloading their materials for themselves, there's going to be no need for the classroom, no need for the professor. And once again, those predictions, whatever their technological justification, don't take into account the inertia of cultural practice and the ways in which institutions like the university are embedded in our culture, such that it's not obvious or easy how you would even go about replacing them, and that they resist change in ways that are very successful for long periods of time. So we're still here today. We still teach, for better or worse, often in very traditional classroom settings. On the other hand, digital technologies have been allowed into participation in those classroom settings in ways that we might not have anticipated 20 years ago. So change is very uneven. Change is very hybrid in the ways in which digital forms are being acknowledged and used. And that's an obvious conclusion, but I think one that's still worth keeping in mind. The heterogeneity of educational practices today mirrors, I think, the heterogeneity and hybridity of our general cultural practices with regard to media. Let me just say a word about Wikipedia before I close, which is that I think we could make the case that Wikipedia very much represents this hybrid or mixed condition in which we find ourselves with regard to traditional practices and assumptions about the nature of knowledge and the organization of knowledge, and the incursions or relationship to this new digital media plenitude that we confront. On the one hand, Wikipedia is a revolutionary encyclopedia. If we look at it in the history of encyclopedias, the obvious and yet extraordinary fact that it is a user-constructed encyclopedia is something that is surprising to me, that it works as well as it does, and that it serves the cultural functions that it does. In another way, the Wikipedia is performing the same kind of cultural work for today that earlier encyclopedias performed for their eras, both in terms of summarizing knowledge and in terms of providing or assuming a certain kind of epistemology or organization of knowledge appropriate to the age. So you could make that argument for the French encyclopédie, you could make that argument for the medieval encyclopedias, you could make the argument for Pliny the Elder's natural history. Each of them represented the intersection of particular technologies of book production and presentation and particular cultural assumptions about the organization of knowledge. What's interesting about Wikipedia is that on the one hand, it takes advantage of the affordances of digital technology, the most obvious being the vast amount of information that you can comfortably store in an interface like this. So for example, Wikipedia itself claims that if you put all of the Wikipedia texts and images into volumes the size of the volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica, you would have about 2,600 volumes, which is obviously totally inconceivable for a print encyclopedia. You can't handle something that's 2,600 volumes, at least you can't sell it to individuals. It's hard to look things up. It's extremely unwieldy to think of anything that large. With Wikipedia, that size is easily accommodated. On the other hand, there are ways in which the Wikipedia is still functioning under assumptions of knowledge production and definition that belong to the age of print, or certainly are associated with the age of print. You know the canons under which editors are supposed to operate when writing articles for the Wikipedia include the notion of no original knowledge. It's supposed to be received knowledge, summaries of received knowledge, the whole notion of knowledge as accumulating and being received in this way, having a fixed, established form is something that one could argue belongs more appropriately to the age of print than it does to the age of the digital. The notion of neutral point of view is actually a kind of claim for that it's possible to have an overview of knowledge that stands outside of any particular point of view, and that also that kind of objectivity could be said to be something that is not particularly congenial to digital forms. So there are ways in which the Wikipedia itself is a hybrid of cultural practices and assumptions from the past and those that are facilitated by digital culture. I want just to, in closing, to come back to my plenitude and reiterate the suggestion that our contemporary media culture is significantly different in the ways that it counts regard to knowledge and knowing. Print culture has a view of knowledge embodied in the circular reading room of the Library of Congress, that there's a center to knowledge, that it's possible to establish a kind of firm grasp on knowledge and organization that radiates out from that center. This print paradigm, what counts as knowledge, still exists, but it is no longer unambiguously shared by the whole of our media culture. The print paradigm exists alongside and indeed inside the plenitude of our media culture today, with other paradigms in a kind of tangled mass. The plenitude of our media culture is comprised of many overlapping communities of producers and consumers, some of these supported in part by the medium of printed books, some not. Print culture, and here I mean the university, the publishing industry, the literary community, the community of belles lettres, is not really coming to terms yet with its displacement from an assumed cultural center. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank the distinguished colleagues who've come here, especially just now Jay Bolter and the others. It's really a privilege and honor to be on the same panels with people of this importance and interest. So this has been a very stimulating weekend. Getting too old for this much excitement. And I especially like the visualizations. I mean, I talk about being a little lazy, so I love this idea. You just put an image up there, you get these images, and you can swipe them and steal them from Jay's presentation. And I really like that. I like that closing image of the visualization of sort of the astrophysics image, sort of like from the Hubble telescope. And you know, if only Carl Sagan were here to say billions and billions and billions of books. I wonder if my computer, Watson, would think that was funny. I have no idea why, if it is funny or why it's funny. But this, so I just want to make a couple of points very briefly, perhaps pick up on some of the interesting points that Jay has made. First of all, plenitude. I like this idea of printing out Wikipedia into 2,600 volumes. You know, I have my own kind of statistical images of that represent how the literate apparatus has overrun itself, has destroyed, if you like, itself by its own success in producing information. So I was reading a statistic about the extraordinary adequacy of the Encyclopedia of Diderot and others, the philosophers, to the state of knowledge in the 18th century, so that you could actually build just about all the equipment that you needed to have a civilization using the diagrams and plans and so forth that were in the Encyclopedia. You could make flour mills and houses and you know, use lumber and all kinds of things just using those diagrams. So imagine that kind of adequacy of the Encyclopedia Britannica was as adequate to the state of knowledge today, to say that you could actually build a cyclotron, you know, something like that, using the diagrams that are in the Encyclopedia Britannica, you'd need 100 million volumes. Talk about being able to, put yourself through college selling encyclopedias, it's like a second or something, make a fortune. But just to say it's completely inadequate. And so we're talking about platforms and technologies and expense and so forth, and there is some expense involved. I said in a budget meeting one time, the dean was complaining to the chair of computer science about how much that department was costing. They need servers, and they need constantly, every 6 months, they claim they need new computers to keep updated and software and so forth. It's costing a fortune. He said, why can't you be more like the math department? So all they need are pencil, paper, and wastebaskets. Or he said, even better, be more like the English department, because all they need is paper and pencil. So I don't think Watson would find that funny either. But so it's true, people say, like, you take something like this costs about $2, about 150 pages of paper for a couple of dollars. I buy a pen, like you can get 20 of these for $2. So let's say for $4, you have the technology of writing. Now granted, we would have wastebaskets in the English department if they budget us, for them. Through our, we actually don't throw anything away. But then, how much does it cost to learn to use that equipment? An old statistic is actually that the state of Florida puts $100,000 into each student, K through 12. So it costs $100,000 to get you through high school. And we all know that nobody, per kid, and we all know that nobody can write after high school. And then it takes another $100,000, more or less, even probably more than that now, the true cost of getting a student through the University of Florida or a four-year program. So $200,000, and everybody agrees that nobody can write. So imagine $200,000 in training, and still almost nobody can write. You can barely read. So the point here is that literacy, as an apparatus, is extremely difficult. It's really, really hard as a craft to be any good at it. So we just kind of have that in mind. Now, so the second point I want to make really regards the comment on epistemology. In the roundtable, I got to get my oar in about the apparatus and the invention of rhetoric, and logic, and metaphysics, and all that. So I'd say it's more than epistemology; it's metaphysics. But just to say, there is a limit here. This Jay rightly called attention to this idea of growth, and not want to get caught up in the vocabulary or in the ideology of infinite growth. And in fact, what Avatar emergency is about is limit. And we want to think about limit and measure. The loss of that, what we are called fatal strategy, just this infinite transgression, which does not have a happy ending. We think about the fact that, all right, so Google is maybe, and maybe Facebook is up to 1 billion users. We're going to have to keep growing because you all know that in October of last year we hit 7 billion people on the planet. That was the sort of official date. And you might have seen that in 14 years there's going to be another billion people. So we're going to be 8 billion people 14 years from now. So about every 12 years there's going to be another billion people on the planet. Now where does that stop? At what point do we have to say some dope or when the planet can't sustain that? Related to that, keep in mind that right now, think about electricity. So even when I published Electronic Monuments, the editors of Minnesota wanted me to say, don't call it electronic. That's such an old-fashioned term. Let's get network or soft, soft monuments, network monuments. So I want to stay with electronic because I want to remind people that electricity is what drives all of this. And electricity is definitely a limited resource. Right now, I don't know how recent this statistic is, but something like 3% of all energy used in the United States right now goes to running these servers, these gigantic servers that are concentrated in a couple of places like North Carolina, maybe out west, I forget which state. But there are states that there are situations that produce a lot of their electricity very dirty. It's it's cheap and it's very dirty, it's coal powered. So 37% of Google's energy, for example, is provided by coal powered, very dirty plants. So, so sort of what's invisible here is use of energy. So it's all visible. Electricity is it's not like, we choo-choo trains or something. It's very hard to see what's happening. I know some colleagues now are working with a Superfund site here in Gainesville that was a very, very polluted site here in Gainesville that was due to treatment of wood for about 100 years locally. And this was zapped into the ground, leached into the ground, just heading towards our well field. And I was trying to design a video or something that would help people understand that our own involvement, because everybody's pointing at this corporation, Captain Copper's corporation that treated this wood and so forth, and holding them responsible. And so I had this idea for this video. Of course, I'm too lazy to make it, but I had this idea that I was going to, because what Captain Copper's treated mostly was wood telephone poles to preserve them. So the wooden telephone poles carry the electronic wires. And I was going to trace those poles, where they went. I was going to find who were those people that were using these poles, that were using electronic wires, and hold them responsible for this. And so the video was I was going to go up to one particular house, I was going to pick this house, I was going to beat on the door, I was going to confront this person, and I was going to answer the door myself. Turn on the TV, honey. We're all complicit in this. So I guess it's just this sense of that be interested in some comments on this idea. There is some upper limit here to this expansion that is based on an infrastructure. It's very expensive. I had a student in my class last spring did a project about get rid of our TV sets and send them to China, and there's enormous pollution going on in China through these old TVs that are being thrown in these land fills and so on. So I think this is an issue of responsibility that I'd be interested in hearing some more comments on. Thanks.
University publishing belles lettres, having not come to terms with the displacement of the assumed cultural center. And I wanted to introduce another binary maybe between leisure and labor, and the question of is there a way with new media that boundary between leisure and labor disappears, and whether part of the problem, because I'm thinking of books, so books in belles lettres are associated with leisure, and there's a way in which you have this image of sort of leisurely reading next to the fireplace, but within the university, or going back to the question of the humanities, the book is really the past form that's assumed to be sort of the best form within the humanities to develop the depth of an argument. And so is there some kind of suspicion vis-a-vis the humanities that it is so much associated with the book, as that's also associated in other spheres with leisure? So I'm just sort of thinking of other kinds of categories. So this morning we were thinking about sort of historical narratives, and you were thinking of it sort of in more of a spatial model. But what are other categories to think about the book and new media? And so I was just thinking about our labor associated with the book and leisure, and how this boundary is disappearing in new media.
My first inclination would be, however, to suggest the question is the relationship of leisure and labor to different media forms, the book in print or digital forms. My first inclination would be to argue that this was more a question of cultural practices than anything inherent in the medium or media, because, after all, as you just said, books can be part of work, right, or they can be part of leisure, and obviously the digital technology can be part of leisure and can also be part of work. In fact, I think more of the criticisms of a technology promoting leisure have been hurled by the traditional institutions at digital technology, perhaps than the other way around. In other words, video games, right? That kids are playing video games rather than doing real work, reading. The notion that reading is work, and that digital technology is somehow less laborious, less serious, less engaged. It gets back to where we started with the Symposium of Lisa's analysis of notions of deep absorptive reading, absorption in reading as opposed to scanning and so on, and question of whether, in fact, any of those practices can be associated with particular media. I think, and what I'm inclined to think of is that, as an example of how this can be a question of cultural practice, is, for example, the way in which you could think of American culture as one that seems to like to elide the boundaries between work and play in ways that if you've lived in Europe, or at least certain countries in Europe, tend to seem to have a stronger sense of division. So I've lived in Germany at various times, and one of the things that struck me was that people tended to have time for work. You work a certain set of hours during the day. When that's over, it's time for leisure. And it's reinforced in the culture by, they just close everything, right? You can't decide at 9 o'clock at night to do your grocery shopping because the grocery stores are closed. Those are cultural practices that then can be inscribed into media forms if you choose to do so, but I don't think they're inherent in the media forms, and I don't even think they're, at this point, particularly inherent in our cultural conceptions of those media forms, except, as I say, that there tends to be the criticism on the part of traditional print culture that digital culture promotes too much leisure, too much play, or too much distracted reading, distracted or inappropriate movement back and forth, various kinds of activities that is actually ultimately not productive. So you're sitting around and you're surfing, and when you're looking for something for your work, you suddenly get distracted and you're off playing. That's a criticism that's been made of digital media forms, but I don't think that even that, again, I don't think it's inherent in the medium, but it's something that has to do with cultural practices. Yeah.
Can you try to describe for me what the difference for you would be if you were sitting, say, by a cozy fireplace, either reading a codex-style book or an iPad book? What would be the main difference for you?
I think it would be the difference of inherited cultural assumptions about the nature of those two activities. Well, inherited cultural assumptions about the nature of reading a printed book. Notice how you put it by a cozy fireplace. And even the cozy fireplace doesn't seem to really be particularly appropriate to the iPad, although there's no reason why you can't read it by a cozy fire. The notion that we have now assumed or inscribed into the practices of reading print values that we think are appropriate that might therefore be lost in digital culture. And I'm not immune to that. I do feel, oh yeah, that an armchair and a good novel in print, that's appropriate for that scene. And the iPad I should be reading in some other context. Actually, I was just thinking about this as we were walking over for this session, is that in this controversy that's going on, I think it's between Samsung and Apple. Apple is suing everyone, and everyone's suing Apple over their intellectual property. I think that Samsung, with its tablet, in its preliminary presentations before some court, showed an image of the astronaut in 2001 who appears to be reading a tablet computer, and this is in 1968, was that what we made? Appears to be reading a tablet computer on the spaceship that's on its way to Jupiter. That seems to be where the tablets belong, the spaceships on their way to Jupiter, whereas books belong by cozy fireplaces. And so there are all sorts of inherited cultural assumptions about the relationships between certain media forms and certain kinds of reading, certain kinds of practices. And I'm not even sure if those assumptions aren't in some ways self-fulfilling. That is to say, we may write certain kinds of texts for and with certain kinds of media because we've inherited cultural assumptions about what's appropriate for those forms. And of course, it's a constant process of revision too. John and everyone here at the University of Florida who's been involved in putting together this magnificent program and inviting me to participate in it. I realized that my title here, The End of Books, is a little bit intimidating for we were talking about titles earlier. And so I want to begin by saying that I'm not actually predicting the end of books. What I mean to do with this title is simply to consider not the end of books per se, but the possibility that the status of printed books might change in our culture and frankly diminish. So it might be more in the spirit of this conference to suggest the title of The Future of Books. And I do not pretend to be able to give a comprehensive account of the future of the book either, but I don't have to because of the work of so many of the other speakers and respondents at the symposium. Lisa and David and their respondents yesterday have given us much to think about, and I know we're all looking forward to hearing what Bob has to say in the afternoon and to Terry's response. So I only propose to offer some observations from my perspective, which is an admittedly idiosyncratic one, or at least different for reasons that I was suggesting in the panel last hour, because I now work in a program of digital media where the book itself, the printed book, is no longer the central media artifact. We could ask the question about the future of the book or the future of books in several ways. The future of the book as a form, the future of the book in its materiality, that is, in print, the future of literature or literacy in print, the future of certain forms of discursive knowledge that have become and been so powerful and influential in the age of print. But I want to start in a somewhat different place. As I say, I work in a digital media program, and my context is therefore other media, largely digital media. And so I want to begin not with books themselves, but with media culture in which books are situated. It is hard to write about the size and scope of our current media culture without superlatives. Traditional television and film still have audiences in the hundreds of millions, sometimes billions, if you think about the Olympics. And the newer participatory digital media have now reached comparable levels. A survey of the internet in 2010, therefore already obsolete, put the number of internet users at 1.97 billion, almost 2 billion, a percentage of the Earth's population that is incomprehensibly large. The number of websites predicted or estimated at 255 million. The number of Facebook users at 600 million, and you can see some of the other figures for social media. The number of blogs at 152 million. 2010 saw 25 billion tweets on the microblogging site Twitter. And these figures, as I've said, are already out of date. I've heard the figure 800 million for Facebook, or Mashable.com just reported 1 billion users. As the Sean Parker character says in The Social Network, $1 million isn't cool. You know what's cool? $1 billion. Well, by that metric, Facebook is or soon will be cool. I cite this, and then I immediately become conscious of engaging in a rhetoric of infinite growth. This is the rhetoric, perhaps associated with the notion of the rhetoric of crisis that Terry was talking about a few minutes ago, that's claimed over and over again for various digital media forms. For example, for MMOs like Second Life, you heard that claim in the mid-2000s of the last decade. The notion that these forms are undergoing exponential growth, and the prediction, therefore, that the rate will eventually include everyone on Earth. And of course, the growth often is exponential at first until it approaches some asymptote, which is, almost always, much less than everyone on Earth. The exception seems to be Facebook, whose asymptote, if it's reaching it now, is 1/7 of the Earth's population, or 1/2 of everybody online. 35 hours of video were uploaded to YouTube every minute in 2010. 2 billion YouTube videos were viewed in that year. 3 billion photos were uploaded to Facebook every month. Both in absolute numbers and in rates of participation, more people in the developed countries of North America, Europe, and Asia are publishing or communicating in digital form than could ever have been possible in the case of print. Now, you've heard figures like these, and perhaps you've become inured to them. Perhaps you find it irrelevant to think in these terms. But I suggest that it is sometimes useful to do so, if only as an exercise in a kind of intellectual humility. The condition of media culture today is what I would call a plenitude, an abundance that easily accommodates and indeed swallows up the contradictory forces of old and new media, high and popular culture, and any ability on our part to appreciate its size and diversity. This is an image that attempts to make sense of that plenitude. It's a map that purports to show millions of Facebook friendships as links between the cities in which the individuals are located. The Facebook links themselves define the shapes of continents and countries and suggest how strong a force new media may be, how massive the connections are. Yet it also familiarizes these enormous numbers for us by giving them shapes that we already know. This is an image that I actually prefer for the digital plenitude. Hundreds of millions of active IP addresses on the internet, with special coloring to indicate size and speed, made by Barrett Lyon and his so-called OPT project, which seems to have ended in 2005, so it too is already out of date, although in this case, I think it makes little difference. This visualization, which has been displayed at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, quite obviously makes the internet look like a portion of the sky photographed by a telescope and then enhanced with false colors. What it reveals most of all is the enormity of the internet. Its beauty coming from, and in a sense, masking the complexity of the whole. And when we remember that this image represents internet connections, I can't help thinking of William Gibson's definition of cyberspace. Lisa invoked Gibson yesterday in her analysis of reading. A consensual hallucination experienced daily by billions of legitimate operators in every nation, by children being taught mathematical concepts, a graphical representation of data abstracted from the banks of every computer in the human system, unthinkable complexity, lines of light ranged